The Queen sat alone in St. George's Chapel, a solitary figure draped in black, separated from her family by an empty space that spoke louder than any words ever could. For the first time in over 7 centuries of royal funerals, the ancient protocols that had governed the House of Windsor were being quietly dismantled, piece by piece, tradition by tradition. What the world witnessed on that April morning in 2021 wasn't just the burial of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. It was the moment when a 95-year-old monarch chose love over ceremony, intimacy over spectacle, and humanity over the suffocating weight of royal expectation. But this story doesn't begin with his death. It begins 3 years earlier in a private study at Windsor Castle, where an aging prince sat across from his wife of 73 years and made a request so unprecedented, so contrary to everything the royal family represented, that would force the monarchy to confront a question they had never dared to ask. What happens when duty finally bows to the heart? The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the private study at Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, sat reviewing documents that would never see the light of day. At 97, his hands showed the wear of nearly a century of life, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he had first walked into Buckingham Palace as a young naval officer. Elizabeth sat across from him, her own papers forgotten as she watched her husband of 7 decades struggle with something that seemed to weigh heavier on him than any of the countless duties he had performed in service to the crown. The conversation that would change everything began quietly, almost hesitantly. Philip had always been a man of action, someone who spoke his mind without reservation, but this was different. This touched the very heart of what it meant to be royal, what it meant to serve a tradition that stretched back through centuries of pomp and circumstance. He had been thinking about his funeral arrangements, he told her, and he had requests that would make the palace officials turn pale with horror. Elizabeth listened as her husband outlined his vision for what would come after his death. No lying in state at Westminster Hall, where hundreds of thousands would queue for days to pay their respects. No grand procession through the streets of London with horses and military bands and all the theatrical majesty that had marked royal funerals for generations. No guest list that read like a directory of world leaders and dignitaries. Instead, he wanted something smaller, more personal, more in keeping with the man he had been rather than the title he had carried. The Duke of Edinburgh had never been comfortable with the excessive ceremony that surrounded royal life. Throughout his 99 years, he had endured countless state occasions, formal dinners, and public appearances where every gesture was choreographed and every word was measured for its potential impact on the monarchy's reputation. He had played his role faithfully, walking the required 2 steps behind his wife, offering the appropriate responses at the appropriate times, maintaining the dignified silence that was expected of a royal consort. But death, he reasoned, should be different. Death should be honest. As Philip spoke, Elizabeth found herself remembering their early days together, before the weight of the crown had settled fully on her shoulders. She recalled a young naval officer who had courted her with letters filled with wit and intelligence, someone who had made her laugh in ways that protocol never allowed in public. She thought of their private moments over the decades, the conversations they had shared away from the cameras, and the courtiers, the man who had been her anchor through every crisis the monarchy had faced. The requests he made that afternoon were revolutionary by royal standards. He wanted a military funeral, yes, but one that reflected his naval career rather than his royal position. He wanted the guest list limited to family members only, no foreign royalty, no heads of state, no diplomatic obligations that would turn his final farewell into another exercise in statecraft. He wanted the ceremony to last no more than an hour, and he wanted it held at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle rather than Westminster Abbey, where so many royal funerals had taken place. Most shocking of all, he wanted the funeral to reflect the reality of the world around them, not the insulated bubble in which the royal family typically operated. If there was a pandemic, he said, then the funeral should follow the same restrictions that applied to every other family in the nation. No special exceptions, no royal privileges that would separate them from the people they were meant to serve. Elizabeth understood the implications of what he was asking. Every royal funeral was carefully planned decades in advance, with elaborate protocols that involved multiple government departments, military units, and diplomatic missions. The death of a senior royal wasn't just a family matter. It was a state occasion that required the coordination of resources across the entire United Kingdom and beyond. Philip's requests would require them to abandon procedures that had been refined over centuries. But, as she listened to her husband explain his reasoning, Elizabeth began to see the wisdom in his approach. The royal family had faced numerous crises in recent years, from personal scandals to public relations disasters that had damaged their standing with the British people. There is a growing sense that the monarchy was out of touch with modern life, too focused on tradition and ceremony to understand the challenges facing ordinary families. Philip's vision for his funeral offered an opportunity to show a different side of the royal family, one that was more relatable and more human. By choosing to follow the same restrictions that applied to everyone else during a global pandemic, they could demonstrate that the monarchy understood its role as servants of the people rather than their masters. The conversation continued for hours, with Elizabeth asking practical questions about how such a departure from tradition could be implemented. Philip had clearly thought through many of the details, suggesting ways that military honors could be maintained while reducing the overall scale of the ceremony. He proposed that his naval career be emphasized over his royal titles, that the music be chosen for its personal significance rather than its traditional appropriateness. Most importantly, he wanted Elizabeth to understand that this wasn't about rejecting the monarchy or diminishing the importance of royal traditions. Instead, it was about recognizing that those traditions needed to evolve to remain relevant. The world had changed dramatically during their lifetimes, and the royal family needed to change with it or risk becoming an irrelevant anachronism. As the evening shadows grew longer, Elizabeth found herself agreeing to consider her husband's requests. She knew that implementing them would require careful negotiation with palace officials, government ministers, and military commanders who had spent their careers perfecting the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded royal occasions. There would be resistance, arguments about precedent and protocol, warnings about the potential damage to the monarchy's prestige. But she also knew that Philip had served the crown faithfully for more than 7 decades, sacrificing his own career and ambitions to support her reign. If this was what he wanted for his final act of service, then she would find a way to make it happen. The decision made that evening would remain their secret for the next 3 years. Philip continued to make public appearances when his health permitted, maintaining the dignified presence that had characterized his entire royal career. But, privately, plans began to take shape for a funeral unlike any the royal family had ever conducted. Elizabeth worked quietly with a small group of trusted advisors to develop protocols that would honor Philip's wishes while maintaining appropriate respect for his position. They studied precedents from other royal families, looking for examples of how tradition could be balanced with personal preference. They consulted with military officials about how to create ceremonies that would be meaningful without being overwhelming. The process required Elizabeth to assert her authority in ways that she rarely had to during her long reign. Palace officials argued strenuously against departing from established procedures, warning that any deviation from tradition could be seen as disrespectful or inappropriate. Government ministers expressed concern about the diplomatic implications of limiting the guest list, pointing out that royal funerals typically served important functions in international relations. But Elizabeth remained firm in her commitment to honoring her husband's wishes. She had learned over the decades that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that required courage to break with precedent. The monarchy had survived and thrived for centuries precisely because it had been able to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. As Philip's health began to decline in his final years, the private conversations about his funeral took on greater urgency. Elizabeth found herself treasuring their discussions about how the ceremony should unfold, seeing them as one of their last opportunities to collaborate on something that mattered deeply to both of them. These conversations revealed a side of their relationship that the public rarely saw, the partnership between two people who had shared a lifetime of service and sacrifice. The planning process also revealed the deep respect that Philip commanded among those who worked most closely with him. Military officers who had served under his command expressed enthusiasm for a ceremony that would honor his naval career. Staff members who had witnessed his dedication to royal duties over the decades understood his desire for something more personal and meaningful than a traditional state occasion. As 2021 began and Philip's 100th birthday approached, it became clear that the carefully laid plans would soon be put to the test. The COVID-19 pandemic had already disrupted countless aspects of normal life, including the elaborate ceremonies that typically marked important royal occasions. In many ways, the restrictions imposed by the pandemic would make it easier to implement Philip's vision for his funeral, as they provided a practical justification for the departures from tradition that he had requested. But nobody could have predicted how profoundly those departures would affect not just the royal family, but the entire nation's understanding of what it meant to say farewell to someone who had devoted his life to service. The decisions made in that private study at Windsor Castle would ultimately create one of the most powerful and moving royal occasions in modern history, precisely because they prioritized human emotion over ceremonial obligation. The stage was set for a farewell that would break every rule while somehow managing to honor the very traditions it was abandoning. The call came at dawn on April 9th, 2021, and within minutes the carefully orchestrated machinery of royal protocol began to move. But this time, something was different. Instead of the elaborate procedures that had governed royal deaths for centuries, a smaller, more intimate process began to unfold. Elizabeth had kept her promise to Philip, and now the world would witness a royal funeral unlike any that had come before. The first signs that this would be no ordinary royal farewell became apparent within hours of the official announcement. Buckingham Palace released a statement that was notably brief and personal, focusing on Philip's service and character rather than his titles and honors. There would be no lying in state, no public processions, no international guest list that would transform Windsor into a gathering place for world leaders and foreign royalty. Instead, the palace announced that due to COVID-19 restrictions, the funeral would be limited to 30 guests, all of them family members. The ceremony would take place at St. George's Chapel within the grounds of Windsor Castle, where Philip had worshipped regularly and where he had always felt most at home. The guest list would include their 4 children, their 8 grandchildren, and a small number of close relatives, but no one beyond the immediate family circle. The reaction from royal watchers and protocol experts was immediate and intense. This departure from tradition was unprecedented in the modern era, they argued. Royal funerals served important diplomatic and ceremonial functions that couldn't simply be abandoned, even during a pandemic. The absence of foreign dignitaries and heads of state would send the wrong message about Britain's place in the world and the monarchy's international significance. But Elizabeth remained unmoved by the criticism. She had made her decision based on her husband's explicit wishes, and she understood better than anyone what this funeral was really about. It wasn't a state occasion designed to project British power or royal grandeur. It was a farewell to the man who had walked beside her for nearly 3/4 of a century, and it should reflect the private person rather than the public figure. The planning process revealed just how radically different this funeral would be. Traditional royal funerals involved hundreds of participants, from military bands to honor guards to diplomatic escorts. The processional routes through London required the coordination of thousands of police officers, security personnel, and crowd control specialists. The guest list typically included representatives from dozens of countries, requiring complex protocols for seating arrangements, ceremonial precedents, and diplomatic courtesy. Philip's funeral would have none of that complexity. The procession would cover less than a mile, from estate apartments at Windsor Castle to St. George's Chapel. Instead of a horse-drawn gun carriage, Philip's coffin would be transported on a modified Land Rover that he had helped design himself, a practical vehicle that reflected his engineering interests and his preference for function over form. The military honors would be scaled back dramatically, but would still reflect Philip's extraordinary naval career. Rather than the thousands of service members who typically participated in royal funerals, a small honor guard would represent the various branches of the military with which Philip had been associated. The Royal Navy would be prominently featured, acknowledging his service as a young officer during World War II and his later role as Admiral of the Fleet. As the funeral arrangements took shape, it became clear that this stripped-down ceremony would actually be more powerful than the elaborate spectacles that usually marked royal occasions. Without the distractions of diplomatic protocol and ceremonial grandeur, the focus would be entirely on the human story of loss and remembrance that lay at the heart of every funeral. Elizabeth spent the days before the ceremony reviewing the final details, making adjustments that reflected her deep knowledge of what Philip would have wanted. The music would include naval hymns that had special meaning for him, as well as pieces that recalled important moments in their shared life. The readings would be chosen for their personal significance rather than their traditional appropriateness for royal occasions. The guest list itself told a story about the evolution of the royal family over the decades. Their children would be there, of course, representing the next generation of the monarchy. But the grandchildren and great-grandchildren reflected a family that looked very different from the one that Philip had married into in 1947. The inclusion of divorced spouses and remarried family members showed how the royal family had adapted to changing social norms, while still maintaining its essential unity. One of the most significant decisions involved the seating arrangements within St. George's Chapel. Traditional royal funerals followed strict protocols about where different family members could sit, with elaborate hierarchies that reflected their positions in the line of succession and their roles within the monarchy. But COVID-19 restrictions required social distancing, which meant that even family members would be separated during the ceremony. Elizabeth made the decision that she would sit alone, socially distanced from all other family members, as required by the government guidelines that applied to all funerals during the pandemic. This choice would create one of the most powerful images in royal history, but it was also a practical demonstration of the principle that Philip had insisted upon. The royal family should follow the same rules as everyone else. The international reaction to the funeral arrangements was mixed, but generally supportive. Many commentators praised the royal family for showing solidarity with families across the country who had been forced to conduct funerals under similar restrictions. The decision to limit the guest list and follow pandemic protocols was seen as a sign that the monarchy understood the sacrifices being made by ordinary people during an extraordinary time. But there were also concerns about the precedent being set. If royal funerals could be conducted on such a modest scale, what did that mean for the future of royal ceremonial? Would this become the new normal, with the elaborate traditions of the past being gradually abandoned in favor of more intimate and personal occasions? Elizabeth was aware of these concerns, but she also understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to remain relevant to contemporary life. The elaborate ceremonies of the past had served their purpose during different eras, but times had changed. The British people were dealing with unprecedented challenges, from the pandemic to economic uncertainty to social change. A funeral that reflected shared sacrifice and common humanity might actually strengthen the monarchy's connection to the people it served. As the funeral date approached, the focus shifted to the practical challenges of conducting a ceremony under such unusual circumstances. St. George's Chapel had to be reconfigured to allow for social distancing while still maintaining the dignity appropriate for a royal occasion. Television cameras would be positioned to capture the ceremony for the millions of people around the world who wanted to pay their respects, but the coverage would be more restrained than usual, focusing on the spiritual and emotional aspects of the service rather than the pomp and circumstance. The military elements of the funeral required special attention, as they needed to honor Philip's service while respecting pandemic restrictions. The solution was to create ceremonial moments that would be meaningful without requiring large numbers of participants. A minute's silence would be observed across the country, allowing the entire nation to participate in the farewell even though they couldn't attend in person. The musical selections revealed Philip's personal taste and interests in ways that surprised many observers. Instead of relying entirely on traditional hymns and classical pieces, the service would include music that reflected his diverse cultural background and his lifelong curiosity about different traditions. The choir would be smaller than usual due to pandemic restrictions, but their repertoire would be more personal and more varied than typically heard at royal occasions. Elizabeth spent considerable time working with the Archbishop of Canterbury on the content of the service itself. She wanted the ceremony to reflect Philip's character and achievements while avoiding the excessive praise that often characterized royal funerals. Philip had always been uncomfortable with flattery and had preferred honest assessment to ceremonial tribute. The service would acknowledge his contributions to British life while maintaining the understated tone that he had preferred in his public appearances. The family's preparation for the funeral revealed the deep bonds that Philip had forged with multiple generations of royals. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren had known him not just as a royal figure, but as a grandfather who took genuine interest in their lives and development. The stories shared during the planning process painted a picture of someone who had remained engaged and curious even in his final years, someone who had used his position to make a positive difference in countless lives. As April 17th approached, the anticipation across Britain and the Commonwealth reached a peak unlike anything seen in recent royal history. The pandemic had prevented large public gatherings, but people found other ways to mark the occasion. Union flags flew at half-mast, church bells tolled across the country, and families gathered around television screens to witness an event that promised to be both deeply personal and profoundly historic. The stage was set for a ceremony that would honor the past while pointing toward the future, one that would demonstrate how tradition could evolve without losing its essential meaning. Philip's final act of service to the crown would be to show that the monarchy could adapt to changing times while maintaining its fundamental purpose of serving the British people with dignity and dedication. The morning of April 17th, 2021, dawned clear and bright at Windsor Castle, as if nature itself had chosen to honor Prince Philip's memory with the kind of crisp spring weather he had always enjoyed during his outdoor pursuits. Inside the state apartments, the Duke's coffin lay draped with his personal standard, surrounded not by elaborate floral arrangements or ceremonial guards, but by simple tributes that spoke to his character and interests. A sword from his naval service, his field marshal's baton, and his naval cap rested on the dark blue standard, while coronets representing his various titles were positioned with military precision. Elizabeth rose early that morning, as she had done thousands of times throughout their marriage when duty called. But this morning was different from all the others. This morning marked the end of a partnership that had sustained her through 7 decades of public service, personal challenges, and the endless demands of royal life. As she prepared for the day ahead, she carried with her the weight of grief and the responsibility of ensuring that Philip's final wishes were honored exactly as he had requested. The modified Land Rover that would carry Philip's coffin had been a source of considerable discussion among palace officials. Traditional royal funerals used elaborate gun carriages drawn by horses, ceremonial vehicles that emphasized the grandeur and historical continuity of the monarchy. But Philip had specifically requested this practical, no-nonsense vehicle that he had helped design himself over the years. The Land Rover Defender had been painted in military green and fitted with special mountings for the coffin, creating a hearse that was uniquely suited to the man it would carry. As the small procession formed in the castle's quadrangle, the absence of crowds created an almost intimate atmosphere that would have been impossible during a traditional royal funeral. Instead of thousands of spectators lining the route, only a handful of castle staff and military personnel were present to witness the beginning of Philip's final journey. The silence was profound, broken only by the measured steps of the military pallbearers and the soft commands of the officers directing the ceremony. The Duke's children walked behind the Land Rover, following protocols that had been carefully modified to respect both tradition and pandemic restrictions. Charles, as the heir to the throne, led the procession, followed by Andrew and Edward. Their faces reflected the personal grief that lay beneath their public roles, revealing the family dimension of what was unfolding. These were not just senior royals participating in a state occasion. They were children saying goodbye to their father. The grandchildren followed at a careful distance, their own emotions visible despite their training in royal protocol. William and Harry walked side by side for the first time in over a year, their recent differences temporarily set aside in the face of shared loss. The younger grandchildren, some accompanied by spouses, represented the future of the royal family, carrying forward the values and dedication that Philip had embodied throughout his long life. St. George's Chapel came into view as the procession rounded the final corner, its medieval stones warmed by the morning sun. The chapel had been the setting for numerous royal celebrations over the years, including Harry and Meghan's wedding just 3 years earlier. But today it would serve a different purpose, hosting a ceremony that would be remembered not for its grandeur, but for its restraint and authenticity. Inside the chapel, the 29 family members who would constitute the congregation had already taken their places, each seated alone or with members of their immediate household in accordance with pandemic restrictions. The sight was both heartbreaking and powerful, a family united in grief but physically separated by the requirements of public health. Elizabeth's designated seat was in the front row, positioned so that she would face the altar alone, an arrangement that would create one of the most poignant images in royal history. As the coffin was carried into the chapel, the reality of the moment settled over the assembled family. This was not a rehearsal or a ceremonial exercise. This was the final farewell to the patriarch who had shaped their understanding of duty, service, and dedication. The naval hymns that Philip had chosen began to fill the ancient space, their familiar melodies carrying new weight and meaning in this context of loss and remembrance. The Archbishop of Canterbury began the service with words that Philip himself had helped to select, emphasizing themes of service, faithfulness, and the hope that lay at the heart of Christian belief. But the tone was notably personal rather than ceremonial, reflecting Philip's own preference for substance over style. Instead of elaborate praise for royal achievement, the focus remained on the character traits that had defined his approach to life: curiosity, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to supporting those he loved. The readings chosen for the service reflected Philip's diverse interests and his international background. Passages from Scripture were balanced with poetry that spoke to his love of nature and his fascination with human achievement. Each selection had been carefully chosen to reflect some aspect of his character or to commemorate a shared memory that held special meaning for the family. As the service progressed, the absence of diplomatic guests and foreign dignitaries became not a limitation, but a liberation. Without the need to accommodate international protocol or political considerations, the ceremony could focus entirely on the spiritual and personal dimensions of saying farewell. The intimacy of the occasion allowed emotions to surface that might have been suppressed in a more public setting. The musical selections revealed sides of Philip's personality that were rarely seen in public. His love of classical music was evident in the choice of pieces that had special meaning for him and Elizabeth, while his appreciation for different cultural traditions was reflected in selections that drew from various musical traditions. The reduced choir, limited by pandemic restrictions, actually enhanced the impact of the music by creating a more intimate and contemplative atmosphere. Elizabeth sat throughout the service with the composure that had characterized her entire reign, but those who knew her well could see the depth of her grief in the slight tremor in her hands and the way she clutched her handbag. The sight of the Queen sitting alone became a symbol not just of royal isolation, but of the universal experience of loss that had touched so many families during the pandemic. The Archbishop's address struck a balance between acknowledging Philip's public achievements and celebrating his private virtues. He spoke of a man who had found ways to serve others throughout his life, whether through his naval career, his support for charitable causes, or his dedication to environmental conservation. But he also acknowledged the husband, father, and grandfather who had brought joy and stability to his family through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenge. As the service neared its conclusion, the moment approached that everyone had been anticipating. The last post, played by a lone bugler, echoed through the chapel with haunting beauty. The 2 minutes of silence that followed seemed to stretch across time, encompassing not just the immediate grief of the moment, but the accumulated memories of a lifetime spent in service to others. The committal prayer spoke of Philip's naval career and his dedication to duty, but it also acknowledged the personal faith that had sustained him through challenges and triumphs alike. The ceremony concluded not with elaborate fanfare, but with the simple dignity that Philip had requested, leaving those present with a sense that they had witnessed something authentic and meaningful rather than merely ceremonial. As the family filed out of the chapel, the full impact of what had just occurred began to settle over those who had witnessed it. This had been a royal funeral unlike any other, one that had managed to honor tradition while breaking free from the constraints that often made such occasions feel remote and impersonal. By following Philip's wishes for a more intimate ceremony, Elizabeth had created a template for how the monarchy might approach such occasions in the future. The image of the Queen sitting alone would become one of the defining photographs of her reign, symbolizing both the isolation of leadership and the shared experience of grief that had touched families around the world. In choosing to follow the same restrictions that applied to every other funeral during the pandemic, the royal family had demonstrated a connection to ordinary life that strengthened rather than diminished their standing with the public. The ceremony had lasted exactly 1 hour, as Philip had requested, but its impact would resonate for years to come. By choosing substance over spectacle, personal meaning over public display, and authentic emotion over ceremonial protocol, the royal family had created a new model for how tradition could evolve to meet contemporary needs while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. The immediate aftermath of Prince Philip's funeral revealed something that no one had fully anticipated: the profound impact that this departure from royal tradition would have on public perception of the monarchy. Within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, social media platforms were flooded with images of the Queen sitting alone in St. George's Chapel, her small figure dressed in black and isolated by pandemic protocols. But rather than diminishing the majesty of the occasion, this image humanized the royal family in ways that decades of carefully orchestrated public appearances had never achieved. The photograph of Elizabeth's solitary grief became an instant symbol of the pandemic era, resonating with families across Britain and around the world who had been forced to say goodbye to loved ones under similar circumstances. Here was the longest reigning monarch in British history, the head of state who had presided over the nation for nearly 7 decades, experiencing the same isolation and restrictions that had affected millions of ordinary families during the most difficult period in recent memory. Television audiences exceeded all expectations, with viewing figures reaching levels not seen since major royal events of previous decades. But the commentary focused less on ceremonial grandeur and more on the emotional authenticity of what they had witnessed. Royal correspondents, many of whom had covered elaborate state occasions for their entire careers, found themselves describing the power of restraint and the dignity of simplicity. The funeral's impact extended far beyond Britain's borders. International media coverage emphasized how the ceremony had demonstrated the monarchy's ability to adapt to contemporary challenges while maintaining its essential character. Foreign commentators noted that by choosing to follow pandemic restrictions rather than claiming royal exemptions, Elizabeth had shown a form of leadership that prioritized shared sacrifice over privileged position. Within the royal family itself, the aftermath of the funeral marked a period of reflection and reassessment. The success of Philip's more intimate ceremony raised questions about future royal occasions and how they might be approached differently. Family members who had initially been skeptical of departing from traditional protocols found themselves impressed by the ceremony's emotional impact and its positive reception from the public. Charles, as the heir apparent, understood the implications of what had occurred. The funeral had demonstrated that royal occasions could be meaningful and memorable without the elaborate pageantry that had characterized such events for centuries. As someone who would eventually be responsible for planning his own ceremonial occasions, including his coronation, he began to consider how the lessons learned from Philip's funeral might be applied to future royal ceremonies. The younger generation of royals found themselves particularly moved by the ceremony's authenticity. William and Harry, despite their personal differences, had both been touched by their grandfather's final act of service to the family and the nation. The funeral had shown them a model of royal leadership that prioritized substance over style, personal meaning over public spectacle. This would influence their own approaches to royal duties in the years to come. Palace officials who had initially resisted Philip's request for a more modest ceremony found themselves reassessing their assumptions about what constituted appropriate royal protocol. The positive reaction to the funeral demonstrated that public expectations had evolved, that contemporary audiences valued authenticity and relatability over traditional grandeur. This realization would influence planning for future royal occasions across all levels of the monarchy. The funeral's success also raised important questions about the role of ceremony in modern royal life. If a more intimate approach could generate greater public connection and media coverage than elaborate traditional ceremonies, what did that suggest about the future direction of royal events? The challenge would be maintaining the dignity and significance of royal occasions while making them more accessible and relevant to contemporary life. Elizabeth herself spent the weeks following the funeral processing both her personal grief and the broader implications of what had occurred. She had honored her husband's final wishes, but in doing so she had also demonstrated a form of leadership that broke new ground for the monarchy. The positive reaction to the ceremony validated Philip's instincts about what the public wanted and needed from royal occasions. The Queen's decision to continue with her regular duties within days of the funeral also sent a powerful message about duty and resilience. Rather than retreating into extended mourning, she maintained her schedule of meetings, audiences, and ceremonial functions, demonstrating the same dedication to service that had characterized Philip's approach to royal life. This choice reinforced the image of a monarch who understood her responsibilities and remained committed to fulfilling them regardless of personal circumstances. The international diplomatic implications of the funeral's guest list restrictions were carefully managed in the weeks that followed. Foreign governments that might have expected to be represented at such an occasion were reassured that the limitations were entirely due to pandemic circumstances rather than any diplomatic considerations. The palace made clear that normal protocols would resume once health conditions permitted larger gatherings. But privately, royal officials began to consider whether some of the innovations introduced for Philip's funeral might be retained for future occasions. The more personal approach had clearly resonated with public opinion, and the reduced scale had actually enhanced rather than diminished the ceremony's impact. This suggested that tradition could be modified without losing its essential meaning or importance. The funeral also marked a generational shift within the royal family's approach to public communication. The younger royals, particularly William and Catherine, used social media platforms to share more personal reflections on Philip's legacy and the ceremony's meaning. This represented a departure from the formal, distant communication style that had traditionally characterized royal pronouncements about family matters. Religious leaders across Britain and the Commonwealth noted how the funeral had demonstrated the continued relevance of faith-based ceremonies in an increasingly secular age. The service had been recognizably Anglican in its structure and content, but it had also been inclusive and accessible to viewers of all backgrounds. This balance between tradition and contemporary relevance became a model for other religious occasions involving the royal family. The media coverage of the funeral also revealed changing expectations about royal privacy and public access. While the ceremony itself had been private, with only family members in attendance. It had been fully televised and extensively documented. This combination of intimacy and transparency represented a new approach to balancing the family's need for private moments with the public's legitimate interest in royal occasions. Educational institutions began incorporating the funeral into curricula about contemporary British history and constitutional monarchy. The ceremony became a case study in how institutions could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. Students analyzed the funeral as an example of successful institutional evolution, demonstrating how tradition could be modified to meet contemporary needs. The environmental aspects of the funeral also received attention from commentators and activists. Philip's long-standing commitment to conservation had been reflected in various aspects of the ceremony, from the use of locally sourced flowers to the modest scale that reduced the carbon footprint typically associated with major royal events. This demonstrated how environmental considerations could be integrated into royal occasions without compromising their dignity or significance. As spring turned to summer, the full impact of Philip's funeral on royal protocol and public expectations became increasingly clear. The ceremony had established new standards for authenticity and emotional connection that would influence royal occasions for years to come. The success of the more intimate approach had shown that the public valued substance over spectacle, meaning over magnificence. The funeral had also demonstrated the importance of personal agency within institutional roles. Philip's insistence on planning his own ceremony according to his values and preferences had resulted in an occasion that was more meaningful and memorable than any traditional alternative could have been. This lesson about the power of individual choice within institutional constraints would resonate throughout the royal family's future planning processes. Most significantly, the funeral had shown how the monarchy could remain relevant and connected to contemporary life without abandoning its historical role or constitutional significance. By choosing to follow the same restrictions that applied to every other family during the pandemic, Elizabeth had demonstrated a form of leadership that transcended traditional hierarchies and connected with universal human experiences of loss and resilience. The weeks and months that followed Prince Philip's funeral revealed the true extent of how profoundly this single ceremony had changed not just royal protocol, but the entire relationship between the monarchy and the British people. What had begun as one man's personal preferences for his final farewell had evolved into a blueprint for how ancient institutions could adapt to modern realities while actually strengthening their connection to the people they served. Elizabeth found herself reflecting on this transformation during her private moments at Windsor Castle. The same rooms where she and Philip had planned his unconventional funeral now served as spaces for contemplating its far-reaching consequences. The positive reaction had exceeded every expectation, demonstrating that the public's relationship with the monarchy was more complex and sophisticated than many observers had realized. People didn't just want pageantry and tradition. They wanted authenticity, relatability, and evidence that the royal family understood and shared the challenges facing ordinary families. The success of Philip's funeral began influencing other royal occasions almost immediately. When it came time to plan the Queen's official birthday celebrations just weeks later, palace officials found themselves reconsidering traditional approaches. While the ceremony retained its essential character, modifications were made to emphasize the personal and contemporary rather than purely ceremonial aspects of the occasion. The changes were subtle but significant, reflecting lessons learned from the funeral's positive reception. Charles, increasingly involved in planning for his eventual coronation, spent considerable time studying the funeral's impact and considering its implications for future ceremonies. The challenge would be balancing the constitutional requirements of a coronation with the desire for greater authenticity and public connection that Philip's funeral had demonstrated was possible. Early discussions with religious leaders and constitutional experts focused on how traditional elements could be maintained while incorporating the more personal and accessible approaches that had proven so effective. The younger generation of royals embraced these changes with particular enthusiasm. William and Catherine began incorporating more informal and personal elements into their public appearances, sharing insights into their family life and personal interests in ways that previous generations of royals had avoided. This shift toward greater authenticity was directly influenced by the positive reaction to Philip's funeral and its demonstration that vulnerability and relatability could actually strengthen rather than weaken royal authority. International royal families took note of the British monarchy's successful adaptation to contemporary expectations. European monarchies, in particular, began examining their own ceremonial traditions and considering how they might be modified to achieve similar connections with their peoples. The Danish and Swedish royal families, facing their own challenges with public relevance, sent representatives to study the planning process behind Philip's funeral and its aftermath. The funeral's impact extended into academic circles, where constitutional scholars and historians began reassessing long-held assumptions about the role of ceremony in maintaining institutional legitimacy. Rather than diminishing royal authority, the more intimate and personal approach had actually enhanced it by demonstrating that the monarchy could evolve without losing its essential character. This challenged traditional theories about institutional prestige and the importance of ceremonial distance. Religious leaders across denominations found inspiration in how the funeral had balanced tradition with contemporary relevance. The Archbishop of Canterbury received numerous requests from other religious institutions seeking guidance on how to adapt ancient rituals for modern congregations while maintaining their spiritual significance. The funeral became a template for how religious ceremonies could remain meaningful in an increasingly secular age. The media landscape also shifted in response to the funeral's approach. Royal correspondents found themselves focusing more on personal stories and human interest angles rather than purely ceremonial coverage. This change reflected both the public's preference for more authentic reporting and the royal family's greater willingness to share personal insights and emotional responses to public occasions. Educational curricula began incorporating the funeral as a case study in institutional adaptation and crisis management. Business schools analyzed how the royal family had successfully managed a major transition during a global crisis, while political science courses examined the implications for constitutional monarchy in democratic societies. The ceremony became a model for how traditional institutions could remain relevant in rapidly changing times. The environmental movement embraced the funeral as evidence that significant occasions could be conducted with minimal environmental impact. Philip's long-standing commitment to conservation had been reflected in the ceremony's modest scale and locally sourced materials, demonstrating that meaningful events didn't require elaborate consumption or extensive travel. This model influenced planning for other major occasions across various sectors of society. As the first anniversary of the funeral approached, its lasting impact on royal culture became even more apparent. Palace officials who had initially been skeptical of departing from traditional protocols now found themselves advocating for similar approaches to future occasions. The ceremony had proven that innovation could enhance rather than diminish institutional dignity, opening new possibilities for how royal events might be conducted. The Queen's own evolution in response to the funeral's success was perhaps the most significant long-term change. Always careful to maintain appropriate distance between her personal feelings and public role, Elizabeth began allowing more glimpses of her humanity to show through in public appearances. This shift was subtle but meaningful, reflecting the lesson that authentic emotion could strengthen rather than weaken royal authority. The funeral also influenced how the royal family approached times of crisis and challenge. When faced with subsequent difficulties, they increasingly chose transparency and authenticity over traditional approaches that emphasized distance and formality. This represented a fundamental shift in royal communication strategy, one that prioritized connection over protection. Philip's vision for his funeral had been realized beyond his wildest expectations, but its impact extended far beyond the ceremony itself. By insisting on authenticity over tradition, personal meaning over public spectacle, he had inadvertently created a template for how the monarchy could remain relevant and connected to contemporary life. The institution that emerged from this transformation was stronger, more flexible, and more in touch with the people it served. The true measure of the funeral's success wasn't found in viewing figures or media coverage, impressive as both had been. It was found in the lasting changes it had inspired within the royal family and their relationship with the British people. By choosing to follow the same restrictions that applied to every other family during the pandemic, Elizabeth had demonstrated a form of leadership that transcended traditional hierarchies and connected with universal human experiences. As Elizabeth continued her reign in the years following Philip's death, she carried with her the knowledge that his final act of service had been to show the monarchy a path toward the future. By breaking with convention, he had actually strengthened tradition. By choosing intimacy over grandeur, he had created an occasion more memorable and meaningful than any elaborate ceremony could have been. The conversation that had begun in that private study at Windsor Castle had ultimately transformed not just one funeral, but the entire approach to royal ceremony and public connection. Philip's greatest gift to the monarchy wasn't his decades of faithful service or his sacrifice of personal ambition for royal duty. It was his final demonstration that sometimes the most powerful act of service is the courage to suggest a better way forward, even when that way challenges everything that has come before. In the end, Prince Philip's farewell had indeed broken from royal precedent, but in doing so, it had created something far more valuable, a new understanding of how tradition could evolve to serve contemporary needs while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. The ceremony that was meant to honor one man's life had ultimately pointed the way toward a more authentic and connected future for the institution he had served so faithfully for so long.